Test.
Thanks.
Yeah, you can skip whenever you want.
Okay.
Take some time for people to filter it after.
Yeah. Test, test. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to speak about decentralized governance and kind of the whole zoo of it, what it is, what it means. I'd like to touch at the end on sort of how it applies to our chain and the co-op, and what insights we might be able to leverage from the structure of the co-op on this very topic. So first, who am I? I'm Alex Stokes. If you want to find me on any of the platforms, I have this fun little laser pointer. My handle is @AlexStokes, I think on everything. So I've been following crypto since 2011, when Bitcoin was just this like weird internet money that no one really knew about. More recently, I've been kind of heavily researching decentralized governance. I think it's super critical to like the future of any of these platforms. So I also see that no one really knows what's going on, how it works, sort of what we can do about it. So I think it's a super important topic. Even more recently, I've been working on some of these ideas on a protocol called Polaris. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to getpolaris.io. And there's a bit more info there. So I'd like to start by just asking you all a question, like, why are you here? Like, what is it about crypto that like has you excited? Like, are you really engaged with like our chain and like its scalability? Are there other reasons you're really interested in blockchains and like what they may or may not be able to do? Just, take a moment to think about that. So that's like a really broad question. I don't know you, so I don't know exactly why you're here. What I could talk to is maybe while we're here in general. Decentralization is like super trendy. So, it's a great buzzword. Maybe you just heard about it, a friend told you to come to this thing, so you're here. And part of that is because, as you dig into this stuff, you'll see that there's like all this promise and potential to use the technology that we're also excited about for like really lasting positive social change. And it's a super powerful thing. Granted there is a ton of buzz, but I think most of it's pretty warranted if we do our job, which is to realize the promise of that. Greg said this yesterday, that the mission of the co-op was to reboot the major coordination technologies. And I really like that because I think it kind of captures at a high level what we're trying to do with this stuff and why it's important. So a way to frame it is that there's this like movement of decentralization. There's various goals we have. A way I like to put it is that the goal here is like mass adoption of these tools to promote and facilitate kind of these three aims: freedom of choice, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. And that's all like these like high level ideals, and that's all great. It turns out though we have a problem, which is manyfold. One of the big ones is actually the governance of these things. So we have all these like networks flying around, and like people are rushing into the space and doing all this stuff, but it turns out we don't quite know like the best way to like govern all the resources involved with these projects, in part because they're so new and like the domain is so new. And so it's challenging. Already the questions of governance are like really tough problems, and I think it actually gets even more and more complicated, given that we have this like decentralized space. at some sense, it's like you and your friends on Discord, actually not even your friends, just like people you don't even know on the internet, and you're trying to like come together and like work all this stuff out. So that's kind of the setting, is like we have this new, this new space. How do we come together and like solve the different challenges we have around the different things we care about? So taking a step back, we could just ask like, what is governance in general? You could like spend time going to like into really formal definitions of like what that is and what that's not. Just to keep it kind of high level, I think a good way to say is like it's how we answer the question of like how do we deal with change. So like the we is pretty important. There's like a community of us, a group of people, and we're trying to do this shared thing. And so then the question becomes like, okay, we're going along, doing our stuff, that's all well and good, but then like something happens, like there's some problem, either internal to us or external to us, and we have to figure out like, what do we do? Like, how do we coordinate as a group to like overcome the challenge? And going back to the quote a minute ago, if these are coordination technologies, I would say that governance is actually coordination around these coordination technologies, which I think is a fun way to think about it. And then once we have some notion of governance, we could then ask like, what's good governance, what's bad governance? I don't know if any of you were there, but there was an RCON governance forum back in February. And I think it was Greg's mother who like gave this nice little quote. She said that health was the integration of disparate parts. And I really like that. I think it's like a nice way to kind of capture like a really nebulous thing. And I think a lot of it applies to governance as well. So you could say like, if you have some community, they have like, good governance. If we have these different factions and different people in the community that can come together, overcome their differences, and then productively move forward. So, we have hopefully some intuition for governance. And also, by the way, feel free to ask questions at any point. But now that we have this like sort of, notion of governance, we can ask like, why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult to like do this? Why is it something no one really knows like how to do? Why is everyone talking about it? And really it comes down to the fact that governance result, like we don't have like nice little algorithms we can apply to some input data to get some outputs for like the questions that basically end up falling under the umbrella of governance, right? There are these like really sticky questions, really sticky problems, and they don't have easy answers. And that's just in part because of their scope. They're like these really nebulous subjective things, questions around like identity, belonging to a group, and even like the culture of the community and like what that means to you, what that means to everyone else, and how you navigate that. So at the end of the day, we have these like really broad questions like, who am I? Who are we? What do we, like what does the group do? What's my relation to that group? And like, why do we do it? Like, why are we here? So, okay, we have these like big weighty questions, right? And so now you like take all of that and you drop us into these, all these blockchain networks. And I think it gets even murkier at that point, just because now it's like, at least in part, it's, again, this kind of strangers on the internet phenomenon I mentioned a minute ago, where let's say you're like on Reddit and there's like, maybe there's some signed message from this address, like Dead Beef Cafe. And they're like, hey, we should like double the block size. But everyone else over here who's reading this Reddit post, they're just like, well, okay, like, I don't know who Dead Beef Cafe is. That's just like some like hex string. Like, should I listen to them? Like, are they respecting my interests? Are they even, do they have some ulterior motive I'm not aware of? Like, what do I do? And it gets even worse just because like, for instance, you can have things on Reddit like bots and these like sock puppets, where like people can just do all sorts of silly things to try and push their points of view. And at the end of the day, it's like very unclear who to listen to or even why. So that's some sort of the problems that we get to with decentralized governance. Now I can give you some examples of like the sorts of things we might be governing, kind of the content of governance in a decentralized context. A big one is like community values, and that's probably what most of it boils down to. Is like, We have this like blockchain network that's like out in the world doing stuff. Like, okay, like for example, what's our monetary policy? Like, should our token be like inflationary or deflationary? And there could be arguments on either side for why one is better than the other. You could then talk about like, okay, like a core value a lot of these projects have is censorship resistance. And like that's all well and good until you like have troublesome content on the network where it's like, well, maybe most of us feel like we should censor, this DApp over here. And it's like not clear where to draw the line. Another value would be like immutability. So the idea here is we have these blockchains. Blockchain is sort of append only, which means that like once you add another block, it's there for all time. And part of the reason you need that is because if you can like go back on that guarantee, then it's much harder to determine like what the real blockchain is without a trusted party. So that's cool, but humans are humans and like bugs happen. So like let's say there's some mistake, like how do we navigate that? Like do we roll back? Do we not? What do we do? Another one would be like the brand or the trademark. If any of you know like Vlad Zamfir, he talks about governance a lot. He brings this up like essentially like even beyond just like the source code for our chain, there's like the brand. Like let's say our chain launches the mainnet and then like some faction in the community goes off and like forks another chain right at launch. And they call themselves like also our chain. Well, which one's the real our chain? Does anyone know? Like how would we know? Do I just listen to my friend on Reddit? What if they're listening to someone who in turn like, is not informed in the way I'd like them to be? It's hard to say. And then finally, some more like similar stuff like the actual source code, repos of that source code. A really contentious one is like access to those repos. So for instance, like anyone can go and like improve Bitcoin as long as you like have commit rights to like the core repo. And maybe that's not as easy to get as you might want if it's as open a platform as people claim. So there's all this stuff, and like, just to kind of drive my point home, like sort of humans as like a species, we haven't had to deal with like governance of source code, for a while. So it's not clear like that we'll A, have good intuitions for this stuff, and then B, like really know the best way forward right off the bat. So it's a tricky problem for sure. And moreover, yeah, like it's just hard. I think a good sort of high-level summary of why it's hard is that we have this tension here. When we move to like decentralized things, we're used to like more traditional organization structures, right? Where like things are hierarchical. There's like someone at the top who's like making some decisions. They pass those down to like people below them, and in turn. So like this person right here, they only have to really interact with one person, and like that's fine. Whereas now, let's say we take this person, we move them over here. Now they're like in theory connected to everyone else, and it's like sort of strictly more complex to figure out like, okay, if I have all this information flowing, like how do I keep track of it? What's real? What's not? How does that work? So yeah, I mean, it's hard. Is the bottom line. So it'd be cool if we had like some tools to help us like with all this like new complex stuff, right? And in part just because like it's super important. Those goals I laid out at the beginning, like we're not going to get there without like strong governance. And some of that will be like because there'll be active attacks like on our communities. Part of it honestly may just be simple apathy. Like if I like hear a little bit about our chain, I like look into the community a bit and see there's just like all this chaos, like that might turn me off, and then I just get turned off of crypto in general and then go do something else. And that wouldn't lead to mass adoption of any kind if that keeps happening over and over. So it's super important to like do this right, do it properly, but it's also really hard. So like what do we do? I'll give an example of like why governance sort of concretely is really important and like what you could actually achieve with that. An example that is pretty fun is like what we call inflation funding. And actually let me go to this nice little image I have on the next slide. The idea here is like the basic question. Would you rather have a tiny slice Sorry. Would you rather have a big slice of a tiny pie or a tinier slice of a much bigger pie, right? And if you look in absolute terms, you obviously want, this smaller slice of the much bigger pie, because overall you end up with like more value. And the same goes for everyone. And then the way that this would sort of plug into an example like inflation funding is that you then say, okay, we have the protocol can make tokens if they need to or if it wants to. From there you then say, okay, let's make some tokens, and let's say someone wants to make a block explorer, right? That's great. Let's just pay them out of thin air with these tokens, and then we're good to go. Now, what might stop you is that we're actually inflating the coin supply to do this. But the idea is that if you have all your knobs dialed at the right rate, what happens is you add value faster than you're inflating, and so on net, everyone comes out ahead. And these very questions of which projects would get this funding, who's making those decisions, where does it go? All of this only really practically works with really good governance. So that's why it's super important. So I'll make this point here. Bad governance blocks mass adoption of crypto. Full stop. Super important. So hopefully I've convinced you that it's something you should be really concerned about. You should be really thinking about it how can I do my part to improve things? And the way we can start is we can actually just say, okay, let's look at examples that we already have out there in the wild and see what they've done. Some people done it really well. Maybe someone's figured something out and it's a solved problem and we'll just copy what they did. Maybe not. These are just a smattering of different cryptocurrencies. These are some examples that I'll get to now. But you could literally pick any project. They're going to have their whole history. All of these challenges keep coming up over and over again. And yeah, so let's dive in. So we can start with Bitcoin. I like to think of Bitcoin as having ad hoc governance. And mainly just because there's no sort of central overguiding force that's driving things. A lot of sort of early Bitcoin thought got started out of this idea of crypto anarchy. We have this nice little phrase in the anarchy literature, no gods, no masters. That being said, it's not complete chaos. There's at least two strong examples of governance in Bitcoin would be the Bitcoin improvement proposals or process, the BIPs. And also there's a really elaborate mailing list that people use to debate different changes to the protocol. So that's great. These are very open. Anyone can add to these, and then they're out in the community for discussion. However, what we've kind of seen over time is that you still have these special interest groups form. Two in particular would be the core developers, and then the miners of the protocol. And it turns out that over time, these like special interest groups do what they do. They like care about their own stuff more than like the collective. And what happens is like debates can then like turn into like in this case like actual fracture. So we saw last year there was this question of like how do we scale Bitcoin, and the question had been in the community for like years before that, and essentially it came to like this heated debate that resulted in Bitcoin Cash, executing a hard fork, and basically the debate was okay. Bitcoin is like what, a couple transactions per second. If we're going to like take on Visa, let's say, it needs to be orders of magnitude greater. So like what can we do? And there's like different ways to think about scaling the Bitcoin blockchain. One of them is saying, okay, the blocks are only so much, so many size, they're only so big. If we make them much bigger, then we can fit more transactions per block, so throughput will go up, right? So that's well and good. However, it has some effects, because now if the blocks are bigger, then as a miner, you need better hardware to basically participate. And if you need better hardware, what happens then is that fewer people can participate. And so this has a centralizing effect, where like perhaps only the established players or really wealthy players can like step in and contribute to the process, which, depending on who you talk to, is like directly in opposition to like Bitcoin's core goals of decentralization. Another way you could think about it is say, okay, we're basically going to push scaling into like layer 2, some other, there's basically a base chain, and then from there you could like think about scaling in other directions, keep the blocks small, and scale some other way. So basically what happens is you end up with this like huge debate, and it resulted in a hard fork. What that means is that basically there was one network, and basically a different, a subset of the community went off and made a separate network. They're not really compatible, and now we have 2 Bitcoins. And that's cool, but immediately it actually becomes really confusing. I personally think hard forks are, well, I think it's pretty complicated actually, but I'll say at least that immediately you have this like point of confusion. Like let's say your like grandmother's going to like Coinbase to pick up some crypto, and she sees like Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, and like, Bitcoin has this nice little logo here. Bitcoin Cash has this nice little logo here. Like, they're basically identical, right? It's like, for someone who's like not really tuned into like the minutia of, what's going on, it's like really hard at first glance to like discriminate them. And I think, again, this is just a tiny example of how this sort of stuff can be harmful in the long run for mass adoption, is like, it's just confusing. So in this particular case, this is like huge, high-profile one. There's this question of like, this is a contentious hard fork. Like, there was no path forward for the 2 communities to agree. So like, should it be allowed? Should it not? Like, it's definitely like an open question with like governance of these things. Like at a certain point, if you can't agree, and period, then like maybe you fork, and that's fine. But it might be nice to think about like, okay, well, if it's not as contentious an issue, like, is there something else we could do that's not a fork that sort of would maintain these network effects that are so important? So now we'll go to our next example. This one's with Ethereum. And Ethereum's pretty cool because they have this like foundation attached. There's this like nonprofit arm. The idea of the foundation is that they steward the protocol out in the world. And whereas Bitcoin didn't really have this sort of central entity, Ethereum does. And I think on average, it like helps a lot. It definitely helps them coordinate through like hard forks. So they've done several hard forks to like change the protocol and add new features, which is super handy. Generally, it leads to faster innovation compared to Bitcoin, at least in terms of like code that's deployed. So that's really nice. However, you probably immediately are thinking, well, hold on a minute, like these are supposed to be like these decentralized systems. There's no central authority or central owner that's like driving things. So like, how does that work if you have this like centralized entity that's kind of calling the shots? And I think more importantly, you have to ask like, can a foundation, here like the Ethereum Foundation as an example, like if you have these crypto projects flying around, they have these like nonprofit arms, like can we say that they're like really best positioned to figure out like, okay, if we are going to have these like truly open systems, like without borders around the world, this like global phenomenon, like can like, an entity in like Switzerland really be positioned to like best determine like, oh, there's like a CryptoKitties user in like Somalia, let's say, and am I going to know the best way to change the protocol to respect their interests? So we come again to our next example, which is another hard fork that happened. This one was between Ethereum and what we'll call Ethereum Classic. And this one was with the DAO. Some of you may have been involved. The idea was basically there was a smart contract on the Ethereum platform, and what you could do is you could send it some ether, and then basically the DAO would then turn around and invest in different projects, and then you would see some return on your investment. So that's all well and good, but basically they launched the DAO. At the time it took like some huge amount of the actual currency outstanding, but then what happened is there was a bug in the smart contract. And what this bug let someone do was the attacker could go in and basically take money out of the DAO when they weren't supposed to. So it was like this huge issue, like, critical emergency. The questions immediately, what do we do? Like, we could try and roll back, basically like, erase the part of the blockchain that like has the transactions with these bugs. We could kind of say, okay, no more DAO, and then start over. So that's cool, but again, we see again that there's this like core value of immutability that is, a challenge. It's like, hey, no, the blockchain's the blockchain. Like, it should basically, once history has happened, we shouldn't be rewriting it. That kind of, nonsense is what got us into some other messes previously with other technologies. So it's an open question, and again, basically the community decided, okay, we should ultimately roll back, but some people didn't agree, and so they went on to form this hard fork Ethereum Classic. What was cool about the DAO, the DAO is that there was an example of like early decentralized governance here, and that's where they did this thing called a carbon vote to kind of gauge support to fork or not to fork, right? So like the foundation was like, okay, we realized this is an issue. People in the community were also, of course, talking about it concurrently, and then some people were like, hey, like let's hold a vote to figure out what is the community thinking. And the idea of the carbon vote is that you would basically send like a 0 ETH transaction to like some smart contract. You could then, after the fact, count all these transactions and figure out what people are thinking, like should we fork or not. An analysis of this, like way down the line, found the following, which is interesting, so this was like the total Ether supply at the time. These were the people that participated in the vote in the first place. So you can already see it's a tiny fraction of people who even heard about it, were aware of it, were bothered to vote, all these sorts of things. And then from there, this is a breakdown of the people who did vote. You see that one voter was like, almost a quarter of it. So that definitely, something seems a bit off if the idea is we're integrating all these people's interests across the world, and it's like mainly one person is like calling the shots. That being said, the carbon vote here was not binding. Like it was just kind of a thing people could use to add more data to the conversation. But it's still interesting to see. So that's great. I kind of have presented actually fairly centralized examples so far, or like, their mechanisms in part were centralized. So now we could say like, okay, like how do we decentralize this? Like, is there a way to like, allow more people to enter the conversation, at least globally, right? And if you think about it a bit, you'll see like, well, let's use the blockchain. Like, they're great for coordinating people around the world, across space and time. Like, why not use this for governance? And that's, seems like a pretty cool idea. The immediate problem we're into, though, is that we need what's called Sybil resistance. And if something's Sybil resistant, that means that it can withstand a Sybil attack. And the idea in a Sybil attack is that it's like very easy or cheap for me to go and like make a bunch of something and then convince you that like the something's real. So like as a sort of concrete example, let's say if I was voting in like the US election, I could go and like make a bunch of votes. Even though it's just one person, me, who's like making the votes, we would count them as like, let's say 100 votes. And so that obviously something would be off if I could like multiply my voice 100 times. In particular, if like it was very cheap or easy for me to do that. So we can say, okay, we need some like Sybil resistant assets on the blockchain if we want to use the blockchain for governance. Sort of two options immediately come to mind, which are like hash power, sort of how like Bitcoin, you can sort of use hash power as like a voting mechanism in Bitcoin. Also, you could look at like the coins in the protocol and use that. The initial issue with hash power is that you basically need hardware to like vote, and hardware can be hard to get, especially given that we have really specialized hardware like ASICs that you basically have to know some like the right people to even get access to in the first place. And then moreover, it's just even putting up the capital in the first place to like get access to them to buy them once you have access to them. Also, if you do have these like really specialized pieces of hardware, there's like an opportunity cost to like voting in the first place if you could turn around and like mine some new proof of work chain. So like coins might be slightly better for this. You could like go and buy some on an exchange. a little more easily than you could like say find some like really cool ASICs. It's sort of baked into the protocols we already have in the blockchain, so it wouldn't require like crazy additions to like your workflow. And it's sort of this thing that everyone can easily see, because like that's what you're already watching when you're watching a blockchain, is like the transactions and like where coins are flowing. So that might be kind of cool. We're going to use coins to signal our preference here. And this kind of, well, the simplest thing here is that this turns into like one token into one vote. And an example here would be like a supermajority coin vote, where it's basically, I say, okay, the question is, should we fund this Block Explorer project? And then anyone who wants to vote, they just like send a coin to like the smart contract, let's say, that is representing this question. And then we let some blocks go by and then count up the yes and no votes. So that's cool. It's kind of honestly pretty much state of the art, which is in part why research in decentralized governance is really important, is like we can probably do better. We should figure out how to do better. Something that might be rubbing you the wrong way is that this very directly says like, okay, if I have more coins than you, like my sort of votes are more important than you, simply because I have more coins, so I can buy more votes, all of this. And maybe that's not what we're after if we want sort of this like really fair sort of open system. You can like think of different modifications to this to like make it a little bit better. So like there's this idea of quadratic voting that's pretty cool that some people are looking into. And the idea there is you basically say, okay, if I want to vote, I'll give you a token. And then how quadratic voting changes things is that if I want the next vote, I have to give you like squared number of tokens. So like it'd be one vote, one token, then it could be, let's see. So then it would be, I give you a token, you give me a vote. Then to get the next vote, I have to give you basically 2 tokens, and so on and so forth, right? You could do this either with like tokens, like volume of tokens, or also time. So like something that people have looked into is like basically locking up your tokens for so many blocks, let's say. So how that would look like is you're like, okay, maybe I only have like so many tokens, but I could basically lock them up for 9 times as long to get 3 times the weight as someone who may have 3 times as many tokens as me in the first place. So there's like different trade-offs you can think about to basically equal the playing field. But that doesn't necessarily, this is kind of just like a constant factor. It doesn't really change the situation that much. And again, we get back to what I'm kind of gesturing towards, which is that we have this notion of whale in the community. There's people who like have a lot of these tokens. And if we like go to these different ways of thinking about governance, then it kind of directly turns into, if I have the most coins, then I have the most say, which maybe isn't the values that like you necessarily hold or that you want to see in the blockchains that you care about. So now we'll touch on a few like more experimental ideas in decentralized governance. The first one is liquid democracy. The idea here is that, again, you have votes. Maybe they're tied to coins. Either way, the different thing here is you can actually delegate your votes, and moreover do it like really fluidly. So like, let's say there's someone who like is representing me, and so I can delegate my votes to them. And then let's say like something changes, or I don't want to have them represent me anymore. I can like very easily move my votes to someone else. And the idea is that by being able to like change your representation so fluidly, you could essentially hold people more accountable, just because it'd be very easy to take away that delegation if something were to change. So that's cool. There's like a few different blockchains that are doing this. So like Liske is one. The thing is that you have this notion of delegation, and then what happens is you actually end up with cartels. So this is like very like an open air thing that happens. It's like public knowledge. You can go to, well, it's not here, but basically it's liskelite.com. And what happened is that the way this works is that I'm fairly certain these are the block producers in Liske. They say, hey, delegate your rights to me. And in return, I'll like get some block rewards for me doing my validation. And like, hey, because you did that, I'll like give you some kickback. I'll like give you a fraction of what I earn. And it kind of sounds cool, except when this is happening at mass scale, you have like these very entrenched players who are doing this. They're kind of the first ones that made it. And you actually get these like very stable cartels that form. And there's like not really any incentive to like go in and like break these up. And what I find kind of troubling here is that this is actually like accepted practice. It's like known that this is how it works, and that's fine. EOS has a bit of this too with like their delegated proof of stake system. There's a lot of concerns of like a very similar cartel system forming for the same reasons. Like, it's just the fact that you can basically buy votes, and if you can do that the fastest, you end up basically at the top of this list. So, you know, we can say, okay, put like our possible morals aside, what's the problem? And the problem is that like it kind of just gives, you know, whoever's at the top of this list, they just have like, it's not just that you've delegated like your rights to them as everyone's agreed to, they now have some like additional power that they may be open to abusing because of this position. Another thing we've kind of been seeing is this notion of a digital constitution. So like EOS has this, Polkadot and Cosmos both have them. I think at least for Polkadot and Cosmos, it's like on their GitHub wiki. You can like go and look at them. And the basic idea here is like, there's just some documents that like some people have made. We won't really think about how it was made or who has the authority to make it or change it. But basically there's a document and you can say, okay, like these are the rules. And like if we use these platforms, we like agree to abide by them. And that's that. So that sounds kind of cool. It's like taking like analog constitutions in the world and like porting them to like the digital context. But I'd have to ask like, well, okay, when was the last time you like read your terms of service and like actually followed it to the T? It just seems kind of hard to be like, oh, like, hey, everyone's like abiding by these rules and we all read the Constitution and like that's that. So I'll let you decide what you think about that. But it seems a little tricky to have it be sort of the end-all be-all of some governance system. A last one that I happen to like a lot is futarchy. And futarchy is pretty cool. The idea is you basically use prediction markets to determine governance outcomes. So the way this works is there's some metric that's system-wide, and the metric is basically saying like how well off you are. Like a simple example could be for, US GDP. So I'll give the example of like the US. And the question is like, okay, I think that doing this thing by like, 2020 will increase US GDP by like 1%. So then once you have this proposal that is supposed to influence this core metric, you then have a pair of prediction markets that then say, okay, is the proposal going to help or not? Yes or no? You let the markets run for some time, and then you actually see at the end like what they say. Like the idea with the prediction market is that you're actually going to predict an outcome. Is the thing true or not? And then you can use that to move ahead with the proposal. Should we do the thing? So then let's say the market said like, yes, this is supposed to help. So we go ahead and do the thing, and then you let it run its course and you see what happens. And then what happens is that if the metric did improve, then you actually reward those people who have shares of the market that predicted the outcome correctly. The tricky bit with this in general is like, how do we choose the metric? There's this like fun little example in AI where it's like, okay, we build this cool AI. We tell the AI like, hey, like make paper clips because we want more paper clips. So the AI goes and does this. And what happens is the AI gets really good at its job. It gets so good at its job, it actually like starts turning like chairs into paper clips and buildings into paper clips and planets into paper clips until like the universe is just paper clips. So it's really important to like pick a good metric. And that may be why like there aren't too many examples in the wild of futarchy being deployed. And I think that's in part because it's really hard to like pick a metric that isn't gameable and that is resistant to these different attacks that you could imagine. I might have covered some of this. Yeah, basically futarchy is cool. If you want to hear more about it, come talk to me after. But we'll move along for now. Two examples I wanted to toss in here. People who are thinking about these ideas and sort of deploying them with some success are Deckard and Dash. In Deckard, they basically have like a proof of work system, and then they layer a proof of stake system on top. So you can basically buy these tickets as part of the proof of stake process. And then how it works now is that as a ticket holder, you can basically pick different proposals on some lists that then could go in to say like, hey, we should like fund this project or that project. So that's pretty cool. And then Dash is another one. They basically have this treasury. And the idea with the treasury is that you could then say, okay, like very much like my inflation funding example I gave, you could then fund different things. You could have different projects come on board. And the idea is like right now there's actually like a central team that controls the treasury, but they have plans to decentralize it in some way. So again, it's like these are both kind of like based on coins and like how funds get allocated and where and why. And there's some issues with that as we just saw. But ultimately, there's these ideas around like, okay, how can we like make these things better? How can we like grow communities, grow these platforms, and have them exist and actually provide value to people? So it's pretty cool to see that. As I've like gone through all this research, I've kind of seen this over and over again. So there's this notion of legitimacy, and that basically means that like even outside of the blockchain world, if we have some like governance process in place, everyone who's participating has to agree that what we're doing is valid, and they have to agree to respect that. And if you don't do that, then you don't even have a process in the first place, right? So it's really important to have this and to do this properly. Some people rush it or like defer it to later, and then bad things start happening because there's no process in place. So if you're thinking about, kind of integrating these ideas into your own projects or your own communities, you should like think about it long and hard before you sort of charge ahead. As an example, there is this account. So eosio.saving is an account on the EOS network. And again, sort of these like growth ideas. There's like some portion of the block reward set aside to this account, and the idea is then that you'd use this account to, invest in EOS growth, which that is, great from a governance perspective. However, there's no process in place to actually spend the tokens. They're just sitting there. I think it's something like 30 million USD is in the account right now, and there's no process to actually like move the funds here or there. So now there's a debate going on where it's like, oh, well, like this like just kind of didn't really get going. We should just like delete the account because it's like inflationary. Maybe we should, spend only half. Maybe we should spend it all as we planned. Like now there's this whole debate going, and it's like unclear what will happen. And you could just avoid all of the noise if you had something in place in the first place. So finally, we'll come to our chain itself and the co-op. I think it's really important for this community to be thinking about this as we go towards the mainnet launch. What's cool is that like we have the co-op structure in place. And that's sort of new. The idea is it's like these ideas of like sort of a flat organizational structure is baked into the project in the first place. So I think it provides this like platform for some really creative ideas around like how can we like scale the co-op or like use the ideas already in place in the community to like think about how are we going to govern the network once it's live. So that's sort of the challenge I would give to members of the co-op is to like think about that long and hard. So, I'll finish up with this just to ask you again, like, why are you here? It's the time to experiment. Like, these things are all super new. There's all this stuff going on. We aren't really going to know what's going to work if we try it. Hopefully you've seen sort of a bird's eye view of a bunch of different ideas in the governance space. Hopefully have a feel for some of the ideas of like, why would this work? Why would this not work? These sorts of things. The bottom line is that like we just have to like try all this stuff and like figure it out. And the way we're going to do that is by having all of us participate together to sort of discover it as we go. The way that we do this is we want to start small and then like grow it into something much bigger over time. So I guess I'll wrap up. Like again, like I mentioned, I'm working on like a project for Futarchy. Come talk to me if you want to hear more. Definitely, if you're interested, I'd love to talk. And yeah, I guess now I'll open it up to any questions. If anyone has any questions about decentralized governance, let's hear them. It definitely, so the question was like, if we have these different layers, so like I kind of mentioned like L1 or L2, and that kind of refers to, different sort of parts of the stack. And the question was like, essentially, does the type of governance change at each level of the stack? So like as an example, you have L1, which is like your core sort of base chain. And then people have these ideas around like, oh, well, like do stuff at layer 2 that like uses the chain, but then is kind of separate and functioning on its own, and like, should we govern it in different ways? And I mean, almost certainly, like, I think we're not gonna really know the answer until we just try it and see, I guess. Like, a lot of it's like so new, like for instance, there's like Bitcoin, and then we could say like Lightning is their layer 2, like, we'll almost certainly need different governance between Bitcoin and Lightning just because like they're actually pretty different networks. They're very dependent on each other in like some really like integral ways, but it seems like the sort of concerns we'd have, well, I guess the right thing to say is that it's not one size fits all, just because of how messy everything is. Yeah, I mean, like the other way to frame this is like, how do you solve identity, which is like this huge big question, right?
Yeah, I guess I was asking, is there any way to avoid the identity thing and still do some resistance? I've heard something like Lightning as a de facto identity solution because there's an incentive to maintain an active Lightning node because I don't understand exactly, but people keep using it, so it'll sort of like way out to an approximation of identity instead of self-sovereign identity exclusively. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like, you can think about that kind of stuff. As an aside, that kind of reminds me of this notion of like probabilistic identity, or like there's like this thing of probabilistic authentication where you could say like, oh, like I like put my phone in my pocket so many times and like some like gyro sensor could pick that up, and integrating all these signals over time is actually pretty unique to me. Anyways, back on topic. I mean, maybe it seems like you'd have a lot of the same questions of like. So first, like what comes to mind is like, okay, let's say we do some like probabilistic identity with Lightning nodes, but then it's like, are you gonna run a Lightning node? Am I gonna run a Lightning node? Like, is my grandma gonna run a Lightning node? Like, you ideally like, and again, the answer is probably depends, unfortunately, but like you're gonna want, for like really far-reaching questions on the network, you're gonna like say, okay, well, we want the most opinions that we can get, and so if you have this like barrier to entry of running a Lightning node, then it's like kind of hard to see how that works in like a fair way. But yeah, definitely, it's important. Kind of the best we've got right now is just like coins. Yeah, so that was a carbon vote for the DAO hard fork.
Is there, any postmortem
Yeah, so there wasn't necessarily like a formal postmortem, but you know, I can just tell you like some things at play. Some things at play were like, you know, and even broader outside of this, just if you even look to like sort of public choice literature and like how people think about voting, there's actually this whole problem of like voter apathy. Like people just don't care enough. Like you're not incentivized to vote. That's part of what I do like about Futarchy, like I mentioned, is that because it's market-based, if you are correct, you actually have some payout, and so you're actually incentivized to participate. Whereas like here, this is like, yeah, if you've heard about the carbon vote and you care that much, then you can like, you know, voice your opinion, and that's great. I would say the biggest issue here is probably just like exposure. Like, did anyone even know the carbon vote was happening as it was happening? Like, you know, people were trying to promote it through the channels they could, but that still is not going to reach everyone, you know, unless it's like a super well-established thing, which at the time it wasn't. More and more people know about it now, but it's a really interesting question. Like, yeah, like, if we're going to like think about governance, like it needs to be something accessible to everyone. It needs to be something that everyone knows about and can use, and we want to get rid of these like barriers to entry, kind of like earlier, as much as we can. Sure, I mean, anything really, like, should we double the block size? Should we, you know, get rid of transaction fees? I mean, any like governance question you could think of. Should we like reduce the size of the validator set? Let's say like our chain may have that question in the future. Should we increase the size of the set? Like, all these different things. Yeah, I mean, just pick any question. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
It's something I'm not understanding now.
Yeah.
There may be some other people I'm understanding too, so I'll pursue it.
Please.
So, how do we, because as I understood it, people are invited to make a choice between two things.
Right.
And then it runs and then rewarded if they make the right decision. So how do we know if the right decision is made about offside?
Right, well, so you compare it to the metric. So like, here, I'll give you, let's take this example. So let's say like our chain has deployed on the mainnet, and that's great, and we have the validators doing their thing. And then let's say we want to like change some parameter, like for instance, let's say we want to lower the block reward. So that's cool. Maybe the validators don't want to lower the block reward. Maybe they do. It's unclear. So that's where a process like Futarchy could come into play. Already we would have some metric, and you know, I don't like this metric, but it's an easy one I'll give. So let's just say somehow we have the token price of revs. So we say, okay, if the rev price goes up, then like everyone's doing better off. So that's the metric we care about. So you would say first, okay, the price of rev is this. Then you would say, okay, we think that the price of rev will go up or increase by this amount, let's say, if we lower the block reward. So then we go ahead and do that. Maybe we deploy to a test net just to make sure there's no crazy bugs. But ultimately, we deploy on the main net, and then we let that happen for some amount of time, and then we actually see, did the price change? And if the price goes up, that means the metric went up, and so then we're like, yeah, we predicted correctly that this would make everyone better off. So then if you basically, you know, bought into the shares that respected that you know, worldview, then you actually get rewarded.
Okay, but then you've got government problems. Who sets the metric?
Well, right, and so that's kind of what I was touched on, where it's like, this metric is like a really tricky thing to get right. Yeah, totally. Like, that's a bigger point in general with governance, is that like, you can pretty much always ask the question like, who's doing that and why? And you're like, okay, cool, like, we're gonna have like a democratic vote. And it's like, well, who decided we're gonna do that? Why did they decide that? And that kind of goes forever recursively. So my whole like take on that sort of thing is that you have to like, and that's why I brought up this bit about legitimacy, is that like, at a certain point, you just have to like draw a line in the sand and be like, this is what we're gonna do, and this is how we're gonna do it. And like, if you agree, then like play along. If you don't agree, then like go do something else, right? So that's why I think it's really important to like set that ahead of time and be very clear, because otherwise bad, maybe not bad, but confusing things start happening if it's not clear, and then sometimes people get upset.
Okay, so I'll let someone else answer. I think because we're where we are, this is interesting. So if you're, what would be a good metric potentially to set if you're aiming for a cooperative model? So is price the only obvious metric?
Oh, not at all.
What are other obvious metrics?
Yeah, well, like, okay, one could be like block time. Like, let's say we're like going after throughput, and we could say if block times decrease, then the metric increases. Price is one, but like price is kind of gameable. On the topic, like I prefer metrics that are objective in the sense, maybe even not objective is the right word, but essentially things that are in the protocol already. So like for instance with price, you then need some like decentralized oracle setup to get a price feed on chain, and then that could be attacked. So like block times would be something that's in the protocol. The one that I personally really like, especially in proof of stake systems, is actually the interest rate for proof of stake validators. Like you could imagine a system where they sort of buy in to different bonds at different interest rates, and then from there you could say that the metric's increasing if the interest rate decreases. And the way to think about that is like very much in line with traditional bond markets, where you say, okay, like if I'm willing to accept a lower interest rate, I generally think that this bet is like less risky. And then that would correlate into things being better off. So that's one. Then you could think about different ones. You could pick anything. But you don't want a paperclip scenario where it's like, oh, like, let's say the metric is block times, and then block times are really tiny, but that's just because miners are mining empty blocks, and like that's not fun, because nothing's happening. Yeah, I mean, you can, like, the straightforward thing is you just have multiple markets going at once. You could then say, well, that's a little confusing because like maybe as like an individual, I don't want to keep track of all these different things, and like how do I sort through all of that? But honestly, that's a critique of like any governance concern, right? If you want to try and get around that, you just say, okay, we're going to have like one market at a time in a futarchy system, and then there's a serialization there. But it's like somewhat clear like what's going on and why. And then you need maybe some other way to say what will happen. Yep, more governance. Okay, well I think we're out of time, so if there's any other questions, I could take one or two more, but if not, thanks for hanging out.